Okay, well, welcome to this afternoon's session. This is the second session that is organized by Neuronet, which is the coordination and support action of a number of IMI projects in the neurodegeneration field. And maybe with IMI, I should explain that that's the Innovative Medicines Initiative. And the first thing I should probably have done is introduce myself, which I forgot to do. So my name is Jean-Georges, I'm the director of Alzheimer Europe. I'm also the leader of the dissemination work package in the Neuronet project. So with our session today on ethics and patient privacy of the Neuronet project, what we're really hoping to do is look at some of the ethical issues that are raised by neurodegenerative diseases research. I think we're all aware that they raise some very specific ethical issues, especially around some of the legal challenges, issues around fairness and equity, but also issues around disclosure of risk. Would you want to know whether you are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's dementia in the future? And also issues around informed consent and capacity are, of course, all issues that are important to the whole portfolio. But what we have here today, we have four excellent speakers that are representing different projects of the IMI portfolio. So we have representations from EMIF, which is the European Medical Information Framework Project. We have representation from MOPEAD, which is models of patient engagement in Alzheimer's disease. We have representation from RADAR-AD and also from Neuronet. And what we really hope to be able to focus on in the next hour and 15 minutes is ethical and legal concern around the use of remote monitoring, technologies, autonomy, and information governance. You will see that we all jointly in a Zoom meeting, so all of you are probably familiar with Zoom meetings, so please, all of you, if you're not presenting yourself, please mute yourself. But you also have the chat function, so if you have any questions that you urgently want to raise to any of the speakers, you can use the chat function and we can then ask the speakers. We can either have the presentations, and then if there's any kind of burning questions that you have, we can ask those straight away. But otherwise, we can leave some time at the very end for a discussion with everybody. And with that, I would like to present our first speaker for today. His name is Nathan Lee. He's a senior researcher at University College London, and he's really involved in a whole range of large consortium projects like EU Pearl or FAIRVASC or Eden. So these are all abbreviations that hopefully he might be touching on in a bit more detail. But he's also very often a member of the Ethical Advisory Board, and it's in that capacity that we've asked him to give us an overview of issues around data privacy and ethics in clinical research. And with that, I'm handing over to Nathan.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to join you to discuss this important area. I've titled the talk now, Two Peas in a Pod, because I think after looking at all of the different ways of describing ethics and how data protection and information governance and privacy come into play, for this talk, I have to admit I was struggling a little bit, because one of the points I've always tried to get across is the importance of making sure you have the view of the entire tapestry of governance when sharing data. Now, these were journeys that we took when we worked on the European Medical Information Framework, EMIF project. These are the challenges that we are looking at with the European Health and Data Evidence Network projects, on which I serve on the Ethics Advisory Board. And when looking at the areas of rare diseases and so forth, like in the FAIRVASC project and in Helical, having a pervasive holistic view of all the governance requirements is vital. You can't look at these things in isolation. And what's important, what was really important with the arrival of General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, a couple of years ago, was that it gave us a chance to reflect on how all these different components could fit together. So the ethics of data use, the privacy assigned to individuals, the security requirements, the accountability requirements. It was time to reflect, in effect. And ultimately, data protection and ethics, they are legislated separately, but they are effectively, to my mind, like two peas in a pod. They are very similar and they need to be able to work together and coexist. If you look at them separately, then you're going to get into problems. So I think that's the important basis to start with. And I like visual things because I deal with a lot of words in information governance. So I thought this was a perfect analogy. It actually struck me when I was using Microsoft PowerPoint's intelligent design proposals. I put up ethics and data protection. It showed me a picture of two peas in the pod. And I thought, oh, wow, okay. So my dilemma was over. I had a theme to run with for this talk. But just to give you a little bit more of my background, if you don't mind. So I have many hats these days. I've had a long experience working on IMI projects through UCL and increasingly now through my work in the European Institute for Innovation through Health Data, where I'm the information governance lead and the data protection officer. Now, for those of you who may have heard of IHD, we're a pan-European not-for-profit organization whose sole purpose is to try and make sure that innovations driven through health data can be done safely, securely, and effectively. So broadly speaking, a lot of the work I've been doing in this area has been through IHD. But I'm also a senior researcher at UCL, and I occupy the lead for information governance for the UCLH Biomedical Research Center. So that's the UCLH NHS Foundation Trust, where we have a research arm that looks at in detail at these kinds of research proposals and data sharing as part of our bread and butter. So I'll be drawing on that experience very much throughout the talk, and I'm happy to discuss that more as we move forward. But what's always important when thinking about these different kinds of governance threads is context. And I think with Alzheimer Europe and with neurodegenerative disease in particular, we have a particularly interesting but also challenging context when thinking about ethics and when thinking about data protection. So I draw upon this with some personal experience. My uncle was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and also had various neurodegenerative diseases and dementia. And he did his best. He was also partially sighted. He did his best, but he needed a lot of care in his life. And so when we talk about ethics and we talk about data protection and the kinds of things I'm going to be focusing on today, we have to remember why we're doing it. And I always think of my uncle who had his conditions, but also others out there who have these conditions and their context. Because when it comes down to it, a lot of the Alzheimer's work I've done in the past has always involved not only the individual, but their family and their carers and their individual context. So that brings in a new light to the governance requirements and some of the challenges. And of course, as John has mentioned, we have concerns around capacity to consent. But with the arrival of GDPR, this reminded us and actually further empowered us to look at the importance of that context, because that is where we draw the legal bases and the purposes of actually transferring data and using it to conduct research. And GDPR reminded us that we do have to have purposes of lawful, fair, secure, and transparent, and that we are accountable for how we handle that data. And when we think about the experience of people like my uncle, how challenging is it to be transparent with the individual? And how difficult is it to actually meet those kinds of requirements? And it's going to involve more than people like my uncle. It's going to involve the people around them as well. So as we go forward, I think we want to draw on our own experience and considerations in this area. Otherwise, frankly, it's tick box compliance and it's meaningless. We avoid the ethics, we avoid the actual meaning of the regulation. But the reason why I'm so keen to re-emphasize the points of ethics and data protection and privacy and those kinds of concepts for working together are because they have to when it comes down to it. And back in 2017, I went to the European Medicines Agency for a conference on use of anonymous data in research. And it was just before GDPR arrived. And it was actually the European Commission who had dialed into the conference, which as it was in back then in Canary Wharf, who were talking about the kind of dilemmas between ethics and data protection. And they came out with the following statement: GDPR is a common sense law about data protection. That is all it focuses on. Member states legislate individually for ethics, and they all do it differently. But the two have to work together. So GDPR says nothing about ethics, but it has to work as part of the same tapestry of governance. So they definitely have to work harmoniously. And in many ways, we draw the guidance from ethical review into how we legislate with data protection, how we implement GDPR in specific cases. But they absolutely cannot exist in a vacuum from one another. So moving forward, just to give an overview and to reflect, thinking about ethics, this is very much about doing no harm and non-malfeasance, making sure there's a balance of risk. So are the benefits to the individual there? And if they aren't there, are the benefits to society there? And is it worth running the risks to the individual and to their care context in conducting research and reusing data? It's about autonomy, and also it's about risks to the researchers themselves, if they're actually engaged in direct contact with individuals, or whether they're reusing data that was collected under a duty of confidence and is subject to medical records regulations. There is legal risk, there's personal risk, there is reputational risk. It's got to strike that balance. But in broad terms, we have to have an independent ethical review for much of the work we do, particularly in the context of neurodegenerative disease, because the people that we are working for are vulnerable in broad terms, given their condition and given their circumstances. So we have to remember that. So the independent review, ethics review, helps to establish a lawful use of data, in effect, which is absolutely key for GDPR. But when it comes down to it, that's the first step in the process. Provided you've clarified the lawful purpose of the data use, you can look to the other elements of data protection. So if you don't have the ethics fully understood and fully appreciated in context, if you haven't looked at the issues around consent, if you haven't looked at the issues of risks to the individual, you have got nothing. There is no point in looking at the further compliance issues because you're stuck at stage 0. So once you have that, we can start to look at some of the data protection issues. But data protection can seem very divorced from this because it is highly technical and it is complex when it comes down to it. I would argue GDPR has given us some focus on this, but we have to deal with things like the ethics. We also have to think about the privacy implications, which are across Europe, either established in statute or as part of a common law tradition, so based on precedent. So we have to incorporate all that knowledge and learning too. GDPR can help us do that. So we need to think about what the lawful purpose has been established and what the legal basis for processing the data is. So is it consent? Is it the public task for public authorities like research institutions? We don't know for sure because different member states have taken a different view on this. So you really have to know where you're doing the actual processing. And of course, if you're sharing data across borders, things may change. So you have to guide yourself very carefully there. And what on earth does it mean about when it talks about security? GDPR's principle of security is how do we make sure data is secure? Well, that's where we have to look to other legislation and standards because there's a raft of them in dealing with organizational security and cyber security. So we have to consider those elements too. But in terms of transparency, in terms of being transparent with data subjects and their relatives and carers, we have patient information leaflets as part of research and research ethics and governance and privacy notices, but is it enough? Is that meaningful? Can we do more to reach out and get a feel for what people actually understand by what we're doing and how we should govern it? I think the answer is yes. But moving forward, data protection also talks about these other areas, what I like to broadly call curation of data. You've got to make sure the data is accurate, and if it's wrong and you detect it's wrong, or if data subjects detect it's wrong, you have to correct it. Where possible, it needs to be up to date as well. So if it's at all practicable, the data needs to be up to date. But with research, you may take a snapshot at a given time and be working on that basis. It has to be adequate as well. You have to have enough data to achieve your purpose, but not so much that it's excessive. So you've got to get that balance right as well. And you retain it for as long as you need. So under research governance, that could be anything between 50 and 30 years, depending on which member state you're in. but you may need to retain it for longer if there's a legal dispute or you need to do further work with it. But determining that can be hard too. But then GDPR's power really comes in the transference of rights to data subjects. So in terms, you have, in terms of the kinds of rights that are recorded by GDPR, some of them are actually new from old data protection legislation. People have a right to object to data processing, to have it corrected if they detect a mistake, to have a copy of it transferred to them. And they have a right to say no thank you to automated processing. So if you're using AI to make decisions about people and excluding humans from that process, you have to tell people you're doing that, and people can say, no, I want a human to make that decision. They need to be kept informed with the transparency requirements, and they can restrict data processing as well. They can also ask for it to be completely deleted irrevocably, and they have a right to see the data too. Now, this was written with all kinds of data processing in mind. It didn't really think specifically about research and interpreting the rights of individuals for research. So of course, under research, we can't delete the data permanently because we would be breaching governance laws about retention. We have to be careful about what people can access. If, for example, we had ethics approval to do an observational study without seeking consent. Can we give people copies of the data about them without breaching intellectual property and IP law? So it's not always that clear cut, and you have to take these things on a case-by-case basis. But let's pause for a moment and think about actually sharing data. So this is where things can get even more challenging, like I was saying. You may be sharing data with another organization in the same member state, or you may be sharing data with America, for example, where the Privacy Shield, the agreements upon which we can share data with America have been overturned by the European Courts of Justice. So things can get very, very complex there. But don't worry, I think I'm painting an awful picture of data protection here. We do have tooling available that can help us. As part of GDPR, you have to run a data protection impact assessment to look at compliance risks when you embark upon a data endeavor, including sharing. So that helps you to look through on case-by-case basis, step-by-step, what you need to do to comply with all the principles and all the things that I've just talked about. So ordinarily, under law, when you are sharing data, if a hospital collects data for a research project and wants to share it with another hospital as part of that research project, they have to enter into a data sharing agreement. And your data protection impact assessment, plus the ethics and plus the privacy considerations, all form part of those agreements. So if you can do it steadily and correctly, you have requirements in contract for sharing, as well as codes of practice. Now with EMIF, we developed several codes of practice for different players in the health space. So if a healthcare provider wants to share data with another healthcare provider or with an industry partner, we can draw on the data sharing agreements, but also the codes of practice, which define how parties should behave with the data as well. So none of these tools exist in a vacuum. But really, when it comes down to the DPIA is your ally, and the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. So if you treat it like a tick box compliance exercise, you are going to miss things to your detriment. And that's why it's important to bear this in mind. So moving on, when it comes down to it, I'm just going to remind everyone of the importance here of data protection. Ultimately, it's about protecting the people about whom the data is recorded. And we've looked at things in context with regards neurodegenerative disorders and how the ethical and the practical elements within those kinds of research areas are provide particular challenges. But data protection legislation now, particularly in Europe and the other countries around the world who are actually starting to follow it as well, of which there are a few, including California as a state in America, it's very much focused on the individual and their control of their data and their autonomy. So there is a consistency there with the ethics mandate for sure. So when it comes down to it, the people who are responsible for the data handling have to strike that balance between the utility of the data and the needs for rich data, like in neurodegenerative conditions, to conduct the research, and the autonomy of the individual when it comes down to it. So where there is a capacity issue to consent and to participate, you are involving others, like I mentioned, and that's where things can get even more complex. But at the same time, if you're aware of that complexity and you've looked at the ethics of it, then you have a powerful basis on which to proceed. But you can't treat them as mutually exclusive, and you must be transparent. So I don't want to take up too much more time because I think I'm about to run out of time. But I'm going to leave you with this thought. That's the Bayeux tapestry. I like to look at governance as a tapestry, and there you see its entirety at the top of the page. If you take sections of it and focus on those, you don't get the whole picture. And I would say governing data is exactly the same way. If you look at ethics and data protection and isolation, you're going to miss out on the actual richness of what you need to achieve. So I'll pause there, and I see that there's already a question, but shall I, that's it from me in terms of the presentation. Shall I take the question at the end, Ange?
Absolutely, Nathan. You can feel free to already answer the first question, which was asked by Angela. And the question is, how can we facilitate conversations on the intersection between ethics and data protection and create a shared language for patient privacy? Not an easy question and straightforward question, I would imagine, but over to you, Nathan.
Well, I think I've already got a proposed answer. So I promised I'd talk a little bit more about some of my work with UCLH and the NHS trusts. And what we've discovered recently, particularly with the COVID pandemic, it's been, as you might imagine, absolutely furiously busy and difficult and complex. But what it's also given us is an opportunity to reach out to public and patient involvement groups and our wider community. And when it comes down to it, I think to bridge these gaps and to fully appreciate our Bayeux tapestry, and hopefully it's something a little bit more pleasant than the invasion of different countries and goodness knows what. When it comes down to it, we can't do this without hearing from the patient perspective and the wider citizenry. And what we've been doing is to start to engage people more fully in not only why we use data for research, but also for them to help us decide how to prioritize and how to govern it and what should get access. But here's the really interesting thing. It's made boring people like me who talk about law all the time and technical stuff actually think about how we articulate the problems and to make it more human and to make it more achievable and graspable by as many people as possible. So it's really changed my thinking on how to articulate the various issues. So I think the language always has to come from, first of all, the individual's own experience and the way that they felt about certain interventions, certain interactions, how they've dealt with their healthcare service, how they dealt with their own conditions. But also think about how they might view the experience of others. So I think it does have to come down to what people can grasp and understand by direct experience and their own reading. But then you empower them to be able to have those conversations. So it's pointless in asking people to come and talk about Bayesian networks and modeling and risk prediction factors if they don't have a background in statistics. But if you start from what you're trying to achieve, why it's important to invoke fuzziness and uncertainty in calculations, that kind of thing, then they've got a basis to start from. So I think it really is very much about treating all the stakeholders as partners. And I think I'm heartened to see that across all my endeavors, both within the UK and across Europe and across the world, the mentality of researchers getting together and making a plan with tech companies is very much more now infused with the consideration of how patients might feel and how they actually have something to offer. So that's where I'd start the focus from. And we treat it as the entire tapestry and not just the sections that we're familiar with.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I think you definitely managed in your ambition of making data privacy, data protection, and GDPR sound not boring, because it was a really fascinating and very engaging presentation. So very many thanks for that. And with that, I want to present the next speaker, who is Pilar Canabaté, and she is the head of the social work unit at Fundacio ACE in Barcelona, and she is part of the diagnostics team of the memory clinic of Fundacio ACE. Her presentation is on the preservation of autonomy through dementia, and it's part of the work of the MOPEAD project, Models of Patient Engagement in Alzheimer's Disease. But her presentation is a pre-recorded one, so if you could listen to her presentation, but she is here for any kind of questions that you may have after you've listened to her presentation.
Good afternoon. I am Pilar Canabaté, anthropologist and social worker of the Memory Clinic of ACE Foundation. First of all, we would like to thank Alzheimer Europe for letting us share some of the findings and actions gained and delivered throughout the MOPEAD project. Could we somehow take advantage of an MCI diagnosis for better care from an ethical and practical point of view of a person with Alzheimer's? This is a question that I intend to answer throughout this talk. I am going to reflect on 3 questions by means of which I hope to convince you that the answer to this initial question is a rotund yes. Indeed, I believe that an MCI diagnosis opens a window of opportunity to program a more efficient care, less demanding with the nucleus of coexistence, and above all, more ethically responsible. The first of the 3 questions is the following. What kind of ethical and practical problems arise during the development of dementia? The second matter that will be addressed is to answer this question. How could we accurately detect the most disruptive elements and situations both personally, as family, and socially? Finally, and thirdly, I will briefly explain the result of our research, answering a final question. What tool or action guidelines could we design to correct the disruptive situations that arise during the development of dementia? Let's start with the first question. What ethical and practical problems appear during the course of dementia? I think that, in general terms, we can classify the current pattern of care as reactive and paternalistic. Reactive because the probable scenarios that will appear are very rarely fully anticipated. For this reason, there is usually no forecast of measures to face each situation so that the immediate social environment of the sick person reacts and seeks help under pressure as difficulties arise. We can also qualify the pattern of care as paternalistic because the ethical dynamic that unfolds in situations of pressure, urgency, and emotional suffering tends to spontaneously lean itself towards a model that sacrifices the principle of autonomy of the person with dementia. Faced with the demand of a critical, unbalanced, and above all unforeseen situation, best case scenario, the care unit reacts by trying to retrospectively interpret the will of the sick person. In most cases, however, what happens is that the question of what he or she would have wanted is not even explicitly posed. The point is to solve the problem as soon as possible, as the caregiver honestly believes is best for the person with dementia, but without considering their opinion in any case. In these circumstances, in fact, the opinion that the sick person would have had if they had 100% of their capabilities is a matter that remains in a shadowy area and is subject exclusively to subjective interpretation and personal impressions of third parties. The question of what the sick person would have wanted in certain situations is not a trivial question at all. It is not first because answering it properly means preserving a decisive ethical principle, which is the principle of individual autonomy. But it is an equally important question because the difficulty that caregivers have in answering it generates anguish, tension, feelings of guilt, and family conflicts. Furthermore, to the extent that there is no way of materializing the principle of autonomy, the family is spontaneously inclined to resort to the principle of beneficence. Thus, it seeks care that is effectively considered adequate according to such principle. But this principle is interpreted subjectively. In most cases, family members make decisions based on their own beliefs, feelings, and convictions. Consequently, we have witnessed the recurring appearance of the so-called compassionate siege. It is a phenomenon that appears even after a diagnosis of MCI and that continues throughout the course of the disease. It consists basically in drastically lowering the capacity of agency of the diagnosed person to the point, on occasions, of hiding the diagnosis. The compassionate siege is expressed in the form of overprotection, and it is a very clear example of prevalence of a paternalistic ethical model over an autonomist one. Or, what is the same, it is the result of a conflict between two basic ethical principles, beneficence and autonomy, which is resolved in favor of the first. And this resolution may, in turn, cause the principle of non-maleficence to be compromised, because the cancellation of a person's capacity for agency and the consequent limitation of the exercise for their cognitive, emotional, and practical capacities objectively undermine health. In this sense, maintaining the principle of autonomy as far as possible ensures a stimulation of capacities that are added to therapies that, for example, in ACE Foundation, we carry out to slow down the course of the disease. We come now to the second of the questions that I have listed at the beginning. How do we accurately detect the most disruptive elements and situations, both personally, as family, and socially? To start with, we must say that our reflection was triggered by the consolidation of a new clinical category, the ICM. One of the ethical reasons that justify the exploration and diagnosis of MCI is the possibility of immediately incorporating healthy habits and cognitive therapy to modify the course of the disease. But in addition, it is also pointed out, correctly, that the diagnosis allows early adoption of future protection measures. These measures usually materialize in an advanced directive document, focused on foreseeing actions for the final phase of the disease. However, we believe that these advanced directives can be used to extend the autonomy of the person from the first to the last moment of the development of the disease. Therefore, not only to govern action in extreme situations such as coma or death, but also for routine activities of daily life. It is, therefore, an opportunity to reinforce the extension of the ethical principle of autonomy. And for this, it is necessary to know exactly in which moments and situations that principle runs the risk of being undermined. For this, we have carried out a study aimed at detecting and listing critical social moments in which important personal and family decisions must be made throughout the course of the disease. The study was carried out between October 2018 and July 2019. It was carried out according to the ethnographic method and participant observation and based on qualitative techniques. 3 focus groups were organized and 20 in-depth interviews were held. 14 of these interviews were with caregivers of people in different phases of the disease, and the rest with professionals linked to the field of dementia. The interviews with caregivers were structured around 2 central questions. In the first place, we tried to find out what decisions each caregiver had to make relative to care in general, and those that they would have preferred that the sick person himself had made while still preserving his skills. Second, we set out to use the experience of these caregivers by posing a hypothetical scenario. If you were the one who had to suffer from the disease, we asked them, what decisions would you prefer to make now to prevent your family members from being forced to take such responsibility? The question that articulated the interview we asked the professionals was along the same lines. Among the decisions that the family members have to make, either because the sick person is no longer in a position to take them, or because they have not indicated anything in this regard, which ones generate more tension, discomfort, or anxiety? From this work, we identified the spheres of activities where critical decisions appear, and we prepared a first document in which we listed a set of foreseeable situations and alternative actions related to each situation. We then submitted this document to the criticism of 9 of our informants, and then we had a second interview with each one of them. With the new contributions, we finally wrote a definitive document. With these, we have reached the final part of my presentation. What instrument or guidelines for action have we designed to correct disruptive situations that arise during the development of dementia? We have prepared a document to work from the first moment with family members and with the person diagnosed with MCI. This document collects, grouped by spheres, the situations in which a guideline specified by the person with dementia himself simplifies care, minimizes the caregiver's anguish, and above all, preserves the basic ethical principle of autonomy. The spheres that we have pinpointed are 6, and in each one of them we obtain responses and guidelines for actions in potentially disruptive situations. The first area refers to the preferences of the person in relation to their care. Who should do it? How and where? Who is responsible for direct care and who is not? Where to live? At what point, if any, should I stop living at home? How will the care be financed? The second area revolves around questions about personal image. What kind of clothes would I like to wear? What decisions do I want to make regarding makeup? Will I want photos taken? What kind of activity would I like to preserve on social media? A third area of decisions tries to anticipate risk situations and possible restrictions to the activity. At what point should I stop driving? Would I agree to carry activity monitoring and control devices such as geolocators or video cameras? At what point should access to jewelry, valuables, goods, documents, property titles, and bank accounts be restricted? The fourth group of questions refers to health and research aspects, and it asks questions such as, what to do if changes in habits are prescribed? For example, not smoking, or not consuming any alcohol, or not eating certain foods? Would I like to participate in research projects? What type of projects? In case of having a behavioral disorder, would I prefer to be hospitalized or treated at home? The fifth sphere has to do with intimate relationships. To what extent would I like to maintain relationships with my partner? What happens if the disease disinhibits me? And finally, the sixth pillar of forecasting decisions raises questions related to the end of life, such as what type of ceremony to celebrate, or what fate should my mortal remains take? Having reached the end of my presentation, I would like at this point to readdress the initial question. Can we in any way take advantage of an MCI diagnosis for better care from an ethical and practical point of view of a person with Alzheimer's? Our study has shown that there is a set of situations that compromise the preservation of the principle of autonomy of the person with dementia and cause at the same time the anguish of the family nucleus. The document that we have prepared allows us to express both positive and negative wishes and can be a valuable instrument for a more ethically respectful and practically more efficient management of the disease. It is a roadmap that offers orientation to all the people involved, from the immediate social nucleus to the professionals. And although it certainly does not have legal validity, we believe that it can be a very powerful instrument for the social management of the disease. Its objective is essentially ethical. It is about empowering people with Alzheimer's disease, maintaining control over their future until the last moment, and extending their personal autonomy at each stage of the process. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pilar, as well, for that very thoughtful presentation. I don't see any questions straight away in the chat, but I had a question for you, and it's also from the experience that we have as a European organization, where very often different countries are at different stages and have different cultural approaches to certain questions. And somewhere where we found really big differences between, for example, Northern European countries and Southern European countries was issues around the disclosure of diagnosis, where in Northern European countries, this was something that was almost universally applied, whereas in Southern European countries, there was a real reluctance amongst family members, but also amongst healthcare professionals of disclosing a diagnosis and promoting the use of advanced directives. And I'm just wondering whether you had any kind of experience of these kind of changes and differences between European countries with regard to the questions that you presented.
Could you repeat, please?
Jane, could you repeat, please? Next to me is Valeria, is a colleague that will help me my English, which is not very good.
It is very good. But the question was really around the differences in European countries when it comes to issues like disclosure of diagnosis or the use of advanced directives. From our experience, there are big differences between sometimes Northern European countries and Southern European countries. And I just wonder whether that was something that you had experienced as well.
Te habla de la diferencia entre el norte y el sur de Europa en dar un diagnóstico.
Bueno, dile que es evidente que hay mucha diferencia, que la cultura mediterránea es una cultura mucho más paternalística.
Okay, she's telling me that yes, there is a big difference, that the Mediterranean culture is much more paternalistic. And it's very clear that it is.
Tanto a nivel de profesionales como a nivel familiar.
In a professional field, but also when it comes to the family of the patient.
And I see that, Rosario, you have put on your camera. Is it because you have a question?
Tal vez ella tiene una pregunta.
I don't have any questions, but I would like to say that this presentation was 5 stars. Very, very, very interesting.
Muy interesante.
That's fantastic. So we can move on to the next one. So the pressure is high to keep up to 5-star presentations. So the next presenter is Sébastien Libert. He's a social scientist and he's currently completing his PhD at the University College London, but also he was involved in RADAR-AD, which is an IMI funded project where he worked on that, on the ethical issues at the University of Oxford. But I also wanted to highlight that he collaborated with Alzheimer Europe in the past, and he was a really active collaborator on one of the projects that we had around the recognition of Alzheimer's disease as a disability. So it's nice to see you again, and I look forward to listening to your presentation on remote monitoring and digital devices and ethical issues linked to those issues.
So thank you very much, Jean, for this introduction. So as Jean said, I'm a completing PhD student at University College London, and I worked with Federica Lucifero from University of Oxford on the RADAR-AD project throughout the past couple of months, so since February 2020. And today I'm going to present some of the findings that came from this particular piece of research that we did, which consisted in exploring the ethical and patient privacy implications in the RADAR-AD project. And we looked more specifically at the use of remote monitoring technologies and digital devices in this project. So the presentation of today is going to try to explore what can we learn about ethics and privacy from this project. So let me briefly summarize what RADAR-AD has been doing throughout the past couple of months, and is still ongoing right now for the next couple of months and years. And so RADAR-AD has tried to explore what the interest of monitoring and digital devices can be to track the progression of dementia in people with dementia or people with MCI. So they try to understand how this kind of tool can provide information about cognition and cognitive decline. So this was specifically relevant for us because this kind of research involves important ethical challenges around the remote nature of this kind of research. So as part of the ethics component of this particular research with Federica, we explored what could be the ethical issues in this project with the patient advisory board of RADAR-AD. So we conducted qualitative interviews with members of this patient advisory board, which are both people with dementia and MCI, and their carers and supporters. So we conducted 6 interviews with people with dementia and MCI, and 5 interviews with carers and supporters. And so what came out of this interview, so really in the sense that we explored what the issues could be in the future, So we didn't try to understand what they were actually right now, because the clinical trials of the research had not started yet. So we tried to really understand these ethical challenges in an anticipatory manner. So three kind of main themes came out of this exploration, which I'm going to present right now. So discussions with the participants, first of all, presented how at least the patient advisory board felt that because participants have to use those devices, those tracking devices and smartphones on a daily basis in the context of their home, therefore they would be very much responsible in some ways with the management of those technologies, not responsible at the level of the research or success of the research, but in terms of their new role as participants in this type of research. So they would have to really operate those technologies by themselves and really try to set them up. And some of the participants mentioned how it could be a source of anxiety for potential future participants, in the sense that, for example, operating the device or setting it on or changing the batteries or loading it would be this kind of potential issues for them. And they experience some sort of worries about failing the research, no matter whether those worries were actually going to be realized or not, but it was really something that came up as part of these ethical challenges to address. Another one that came out of this research was a participant mentioned that she felt like she couldn't really change her routine, or she had to live a normal life while using those technologies, those smartphone and tracking devices. And she felt like going out of this routine could have a negative effect on data collection. So no matter whether this is actually going to take place or not, whether this is going to have an impact on data collection or not, was not really the issue in what we felt was an ethical challenge. We felt like it was more about this pressure that patients or people participating could experience in using those technologies to maintain a so-called normal life. So another ethical challenge that came out of these interviews was regarding the expectations that participants had in regard to their participation. So the patient advisory board mentioned how the time that they invest, the energy and the resources that they invest in participating in this type of research, they expected in some ways to receive a counter gift, a sort of reward or reciprocity, at least from their participation. So they expected, for instance, that their participation would help to find a treatment for dementia, or help to improve the life of people with dementia. So those are more societal reward, in the sense that they're not direct, but more indirect for the general community of people with dementia and caregivers and supporters. And meanwhile, they express more personal kind of expectations, in the sense that from the data that was collected by those devices, they expected to gain more knowledge about their condition, or they expected to receive feedback about their performance, their cognitive decline, or the progression of their condition. And this is an issue that, an ethical challenge that I will discuss further later on, because I think it's really important to speak about it. Also knowing of the kind of sensitivity that some participants express as well about information relating to cognition and cognitive decline. So this is really a sensitive issue that could even prevent some participants to participate in remote monitoring. So the last kind of ethical challenge that we identified through those interviews was relating to privacy, and the fact that the people we interviewed expressed that some of them expressed that they had nothing to hide, and therefore no problem with monitoring and privacy. And what's interesting is that actually, if you question them more on their motivation or their understanding of privacy, we realize that some aspects of it were actually bothering them, like, for example, monitoring or tracking in more intimate moments of their life, or some participants expressed, for example, that they felt it could expose little failures that they experimented, and that could be embarrassing for them. So So we see how for participants, really this issue of privacy is really eminently subjective, variable and complex according to each person that you would interview. And also there's an aspect of the impact of tracking on relatives or people around the person using those devices that could in a way show indirectly issues or aspects of their own private life. So those are the three kind of ethical challenges that we identify, and out of that we think it's important to propose some recommendations. So I will go through them right now, which are recommendations that apply more broadly to projects using remote monitoring technologies for monitoring. So first of all, it's about accepting and acknowledging the active role of participants in this type of research, this idea that they are the one using those technologies and have to operate them at home, and that we need to address as researchers their anxiety and ensure their well-being to this regard. So, for example, by providing extra and available support in case of issues with the devices. You can imagine a phone line that people could call more easily to get in contact with researchers, for example, or someone that could help them to support the use of those devices. You could also imagine, for instance, to discuss interruption to monitoring with participants. We think it's important because it can help for them to understand when they can actually stop monitoring their life, and actually when they can continue to monitor it without having to live this so-called normal life, so that they feel more relieved regarding this idea of living a normal life during their participation. Also interesting to discuss ways to involve caregivers and supporters, because it really appeared in the interviews how important they are in helping setting up those devices and operating them. The second challenge to address, and that we have some recommendation for, relates to this expectation of feedback. As I mentioned earlier, this expectation of feedback about one's own performance and cognitive state while participating. And we think that by discussing with the researchers on the project as well, that there's an intrinsic complexity to the data collected, the fact that it exists in multiple platforms at the same time. The data streams are also complicated to put together and really to propose summarizes that are more individualized. But even more than that, it's really the fact that researchers are still exploring the significance of this data in terms of cognition and cognitive decline. So there's no certainty right now about its actual significance. And while knowing as well the sensitivity of this feedback regarding decline, there's really much concerns to have about providing this kind of uncontextualized feedback and without any kind of certitude about it. So we suggest alternative in place. We really think it's important, for example, to communicate about the outcomes of the project throughout the entire kind of research progress, and to really propose this kind of communication with participants as an interesting alternative to this feedback. And finally, in terms of privacy and consent, we think it's really important to knowing this multiple kind of meanings attached to privacy. It's really important to look at consent as something really bidirectional, in the sense that it has to be negotiated between the participant and the researcher. It's really important to think about this consent as well in terms of trust and care, in the sense that it's not always easy to know in which cases privacy can become an issue. So it's really important for researchers to seek regular feedback on privacy with the participant through the research progress. And also to revisit consent. Don't think about consent as a one-off event, but rather as something that has to be revisited through the project, to be sure that the conditions are still ensuring well-being for participants. And also think about the consent as relational. So this idea that it's not only individualized, but really something that needs to involve the surrounding of the person with dementia, because she's also exposed in this kind of data collection indirectly. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for IMI, European Union, and EFPIA for for funding this research, and always as well to Alzheimer Europe for this opportunity to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. Again, I don't see a lot of questions coming here, but I will try and ask you a question again, because what I found very interesting is the fact that you say that these kind of privacy concerns are very often very individual. And I'm just wondering, because you highlighted the remote monitoring as a very specific kind of data where privacy concerns can be very individual. Do you have any idea of how does that kind of privacy concern around that data compare to our concerns around more regular health data like our blood tests or medical scans or cognitive tests, for example? Where does this kind of remote monitoring results compare to other fields of data?
Yeah, I mean, it's really relevant to think about that, because it's the intensity and the continuity of the data collection that I think is really key in making a difference with what you gave as an example, Jean, in terms of sporadic testings of blood tests and so forth. Is that, for instance, memory clinics used to do those assessments, but they would do it in a very kind of sporadic basis. And RADAR-AD was really meant to propose this kind of continuous data collection in order to improve those assessments. But at the same time, this is asking new questions about those challenges of privacy because of this continuity and of this intensity of data collection.
Thanks very much, Sébastien. And with that, I think it's time to come to our last speaker of the session. So I'm going to present Angela Bradshaw. She's the project officer of Alzheimer Europe. She started on the 1st of May 2019, and she represents Alzheimer Europe in a number of projects such as Virtual Brain Cloud, Recognized, but of course she's here today because she's also our representative in the Neuronet project, and she will present some of the kind of work of the specific working group that has been set up within Neuronet to look at best practices on patient privacy. And with that, I hand over to Angela.
Thank you very much, Jean, and thanks everyone for sticking with us in this session. So I'll be finishing off the session by giving you a quick overview of the activities of the, apologies, I will start my video. There we go. Hopefully you can see my screen now. So I'll be finishing off this session by giving you a very quick overview of the activities of the Neuronet Working Group on Patient Privacy and Ethics. And this is one of the 4 foundational working groups that has been set up by the Neuronet Coordination and Support Action. So Neuronet, as I mentioned just now, is a coordination support action which is funded by the Innovative Medicines Initiative. It kicked off in March last year and will run for 3 years in total, finishing in 2022. And it involves a total of 9 partners. Carlos Diaz of Synapse is the project coordinator, and the project leader is Leonard Stokers of Janssen Pharmaceutica. And alongside the executive committee or ExCom of Neuronet includes representatives from NICE, the UK National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, Alzheimer Europe and Parkinson's UK, which is an associated partner of the IMI, as well as contributors from Sanofi, Roche, Takeda, and Eli Lilly, alongside Leonard as the representative of Janssen. So the vision of Neuronet is to create an efficient platform to boost synergy and collaboration across the projects of the IMI neurodegenerative disorders portfolio by identifying gaps, multiplying the impact of these diverse projects, enhancing the visibility of the portfolio and the projects individually, and also by facilitating linking up with related initiatives in Europe and worldwide. So the second IMI joint action ran, I guess, from 2014 to 2020. There are still projects ongoing, and there was recently the final call for that joint action. And it has a total budget of approximately 3.2 billion euros, building on the success of the first joint action. So in the slide, you can see the 18 projects of the portfolio. And this covers the entire research and development spectrum, from basic research projects such as IMPRINT and IM2PACT, which look at fundamental mechanisms of how brain cells dysfunction, all the way to real-world data projects like Roadmap, alongside clinical studies that you may have heard of, such as EPAD and PD Mind, which is a Parkinson's disease project. In total, brought together in this portfolio are 239 unique partnering organizations, and these include SMEs, patient organizations, academic institutions, alongside pharmaceutical companies, members of FPA, as well as 23 participating countries, and this includes the US, which participate as a third party. The total budget for these 18 projects amounts to almost 400 million euro, approximately 50% of which is provided by the Horizon 2020 framework program of the EU. And the breadth of this portfolio really underlines the need, but also the value of Neuronet as a coordination and support action, and gives us a framework for the key goals, which are listed here. So firstly, to understand and demonstrate the value and impact of the IMI neurodegenerative disorders portfolio. Secondly, to enhance the visibility of the projects and of the portfolio as a whole. And then thirdly, and most relevantly to this presentation and to the working group, to detect synergies, create connections, and share know-how. So the Neuronet Working Groups were created to support this third goal. And they've been designed as cross-project spaces for experts to discuss their experiences, share the lessons they've learnt throughout their time working on IMI projects and other projects that are funded by different agencies, debate about hot topics in the field, and importantly, identify opportunities for synergy and collaboration. So our ultimate goal as a coordination and support action is to meet the unmet needs of projects. And when this project or CSA was in its drafting stages, the leaders contacted all the projects that had said they'd like to be involved and conducted a survey, asking them to score areas in which they would need further support, so we could really identify the priority topics for the working groups. And there were 4 key areas really that were identified. These were the sustainability of project outcomes, data sharing, and we had a session earlier on today on data sharing and reuse, HTA and regulatory liaison, and there'll be a session on this tomorrow, and finally data protection and patient privacy, specifically around data protection regulations and ethics approvals, which may include consent forms, for example. So as a result, we have 4 foundational working groups within Neuronet focused on this topic, and in this presentation I'm going to be focusing on the ethics and patient privacy working group. So just to go back to basics, and most of this has already been very eloquently covered by previous speakers in the session, so I won't linger. But what the question really is why patient privacy was identified as such an important challenge to tackle. So on the one hand, we know that there are many research participants who really want their data to be shared widely but securely to maximize the benefit of their contribution. But on the other hand, many of you will have heard of data breaches such as Project Nightingale and DeepMind, where the identifiable health data of hundreds and thousands of people were shared with private sector organizations. And these data breaches and other much smaller data breaches reinforce the importance of having really robust data protection regulations to protect individuals and societies from harm. And this illustration, or this image actually, came from a Guardian article actually that was published a couple of years ago. So the background to this is that there's an app called Strava that some of you may use. I'm rubbish at exercise, so I can't claim to personally use it very much, but basically this app is an exercise app which collects the location data of people who are members so that they can compare performance and really map their progress. And in 2017, they released a heat map showing data collected from millions of users. And obviously this tracked all of their locations and their movements. However, when you look very closely at the data, you can see patterns of movement in regions where there is known US Army involvement. And this image is a picture of a base in Helmand province in Afghanistan. So you can see here that by using this data, which was released, the location and layout of military bases could be detected. So to ensure that breaches such as these don't happen, there are fairly stringent data protection regulations, as well as ethical requirements for data use and reuse, as Nathan described earlier on really eloquently. However, sometimes these regulations can prevent the legitimate use of personal data for societal and individual benefit. And that means that we really don't maximize the use of data about health, and the contributions of individual participants and data subjects isn't valued quite as much as it should be. So to address these and some of the other issues, we formed the Neuronet Working Group on patient privacy and ethics. And this working group brings together representatives from 8 projects, as you can see here in the icons. And the goal of the working group is threefold. So first of all, we really want to encourage collaborations and communication on ethics and patient privacy issues. We need to understand what is out there already and bring together learnings that already exist, but are maybe not quite as widely publicized as they should be, so we can capture best practice, particularly around informed consent and data privacy. And to that end, we're aiming to develop guidance and some templates which future projects and existing projects can use to support their work on ethics and data protection. So these are the working group members, some of whom are on the call and some of whom you've heard speaking earlier on today. They're spread across many EU institutions, primarily academic institutions, and there are also some internal Neuronet members of the working group. Jean, who's chairing the session, Diane, who many of you may know, who's the Director for Projects at Alzheimer Europe, myself, and Diana O'Rourke from NICE. The working groups were founded just over a year ago, and since then we've met about 3 to 4 times, mainly online, unfortunately, due to COVID-19 movement restrictions, but hopefully we'll be able to meet in person at some point in the near or perhaps slightly more distant future. So one of the first outputs arising from the working group activities was a deliverable that was published in March 2020, and this will be followed by a final guidance report. So in this deliverable, we wanted to bring together a brief overview of the key legal and ethical frameworks underpinning data sharing for clinical neurodegenerative disease research. So as Nathan mentioned earlier, the GDPR is a key European data protection framework that regulates many of these processes. And some of the topics that were addressed were basic definitions such as what is personal data, what is sensitive personal data, but also some of the areas where confusion can arise, such as some of the GDPR derogations around research and where member states have a little bit of latitude in how they interpret this regulation. We also wanted to identify some discussion points that could be addressed in the working group. For GDPR, these were around identifiability. So can we use PET and MRI imaging scans as personal data? Because some groups have shown that people have very individual brain morphological characteristics, which could be tracked back to them as individuals. Also, how is controllership managed? So who is the ultimate decider of what is done with data? They're the data controllers. And how does this work when multi-site trials are being carried out? How do we pseudonymize data? Do we need standards and practices for this? And also, how do the member state derogations impact on these pan-EU clinical research projects? From an ethical perspective, topics that were addressed were risks and benefits and equity, particularly equitable participation in research. What are the barriers and facilitators for this? Risk disclosure is something that's being addressed broadly across the IMI portfolio. So what are the ethical implications of dementia risk disclosure, particularly when we don't have currently a disease-modifying treatment? And consent is a recurring theme. Not just primary consent for participation in research, but also consent for sharing of research data and reuse of that data, and whether we need specific models to facilitate this. We've done a very preliminary map of LC deliverables that are currently being generated or have been generated by projects. And these broadly map to a few different topics. So data protection and ethical approvals are a priority area for the majority of the IMI projects that we looked at. And in line with the original survey, identifying it as a priority area to be addressed or an unmet need, these topics have appeared fairly prominently. And quite interestingly, the disclosure of results to participants is a topic that is being addressed in a few ethics work packages. So for MOPEAD, EPAD, and RADAR-AD for starters. So there are also many projects that involve deliverables that are focused on the views of people who are affected by neurodegenerative diseases. And this highlights really a growing appreciation of the value of public involvement in research projects that involve human participants. So just to summarize and finish off here, the last thing we wanted to identify with our working group members were topics to address over the next year and a half of the working group. So these were identified through a brief survey and also through discussions and working group meetings. And some of the topics are listed here. So you can see they include the ethics of AI and dementia, and the unintended harms of black box approaches that don't consider individuals and use machine learning and other advanced technologies to predict and illustrate risk. We also have a potential area in public involvement. So how can we ensure that this is meaningful and representative as well? Risk disclosure again, how do we communicate incidental findings to participants? And more broad ethical topics. So how are ethical topics being addressed in public-private partnerships? Do we need a way to better integrate reflective ethical practice throughout the project life cycle, from the beginning of project development right the way through to final moves for project sustainability, along with issues around data governance and enablers of trust in data sharing. So moving forward within the working group, we want to complete this mapping exercise and create some connections between projects based on the work that we've identified as common between different projects. We want to finish our gap analysis of ethical and legal issues for clinical neurodegenerative disease research to really hone in on the important new areas to address. And finally, one of the potential outputs would be a publication or white paper bringing together the ethics and patient privacy work from these IMI projects. And this would really tick the box of identifying and sharing lessons learned, and making sure that best practice is adopted as widely as possible. Thank you very much for your time, and we'd like to acknowledge the funding we've received from IMI, and we welcome any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, and as well for this presentation. Again, we don't have a whole range of questions from the audience, but again, I would have one. And you've now met a number of ethics experts from different European projects. And I'm just wondering, are there any kind of issues where there's fundamental differences between ethics approaches in different projects? Or have you more noticed that actually the kind of ethics teams in most of these projects have very similar issues that they address and very similar answers that they provide?
Yep, that's a good question, and actually it could equally as well be answered by a few of the other people on the panel. But what we saw when we did the mapping exercise was that there were some commonalities in the topics that were being addressed. One thing that should also be noted is that there's a small cluster of projects in which there are common partners. So that is good to the extent that you share learnings across project a lot more easily if you're working with people that you know, and that the project you're working on is a development of a previous project, for example. But there are outliers, I guess, not in terms of the way necessarily that they address the ethical and patient privacy issues, but in terms of the people who are addressing those issues for the projects. So one thing we'd like to do is try and bring the different people who are working on these issues within projects that might not be as closely connected, that might not necessarily be focused on Alzheimer's dementia, is another thing actually, because we do have 3 or 4 projects that directly address Parkinson's disease, and these tend to be less closely connected. So in the longer term, I would say that the issues are being addressed. There is some commonality, but there are also some discrepancies, which isn't a bad thing. But I think having conversations through forums like the working group can only help progress things.
Thank you very much, Angela. And I think we have also reached 6 o'clock, which is the top of the hour and the time where we should have come to a close. So my big thanks go to all the speakers that shared all the kind of work that they have done on projects where they are working on the ethical issues in dementia research. I have to say, personally, I find it incredibly rewarding to be involved in these projects and participating in some of the discussions around these ethical issues that are being raised. I think, Nathan, you also mentioned the importance of data governance and making sure that this is not something that is just being discussed amongst researchers or amongst ethicists, but that people with dementia carers and Alzheimer's organizations should really be a fundamental part of all of these discussions. And with that, I also wanted to remind you that Neuronet will be present also over the next 2 days. Neuronet has stands, so please go and visit them at the virtual booth, and why not ask for a meeting with the people that are running the booth. But I also wanted to highlight tomorrow morning we have Edo Richard from the EPAD and EMIPAD project, who's going to present in one of the keynote lectures on disclosure issues of diagnosis. We'll have in the afternoon, we have Diane Gove, who talks about public involvement in dementia research, also a topic that was addressed here today. We'll have in the afternoon a workshop of Neuronet on health technology assessment. And then on Thursday, we have the leader of the project, Carlos Diaz, who will be giving us an overview of where we are with regard to the project. And in the afternoon, we have a roundtable discussion with some of the kind of key representatives of these IMI funded projects to also discuss the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on dementia research within the Innovative Medicines Initiative. And with that, I'm sure that you'll have lots of opportunities to find out more about Neuronet, and I hope you found this session as useful and as interesting as me. And with that, I wish you a very relaxed evening, and I look forward to seeing most of you or all of you tomorrow morning again. With that, goodbye.